Charlie, what Apple-branded product cost $5 billion, took 3 years to build, and only one was ever shipped?
Was it a donut?
Welcome to Apple Core, a podcast about the history of Apple. In each episode, we travel back in time to explore the story behind a different Apple product and consider what it tells us about where the company might be heading next. I'm Graham Bauer, a designer, writer, and long-time Apple user.
And I'm Charlie Sorrell, and despite having done this podcast many times, I'm still not prepared for this section.
And if you'd like to support the show, you can do that by checking out our brand new merch store on TeePublic. We've got t-shirts, sweatshirts, hoodies, tote bags, mugs, and more featuring retro geek designs by yours truly. There's a link in the show notes, and you can access it by visiting our brand new website, applecorepod.com. So, today's episode, Charlie.
Yes.
You said a donut. What donut are we talking about?
The giant torus that is Apple Park.
What do you say? The giant torus?
Yeah, T-O-R-U-S, torus. It's like a donut shape. That's the technical term for a donut shape, like a cylinder that's been curled around for the ends to meet.
Yeah, I did not know that. Okay, right. So, a torus.
Yes, a torus.
We're talking about a torus. So, yeah, why are we talking about Apple Park? Normally, we focus on Apple products, but today we're looking at Apple's headquarters, Apple Park in Cupertino, California. And the reason we're looking at this is because the way that Apple approached this project of building a new headquarters was very much the way that Apple approaches all of its product design. Johnny Ive, the head of design at Apple, was very hands-on in the development of this project. And they even branded it like an Apple product, calling it Apple Park. And so in many ways, it's the distillation of that particular era of Apple and the resurgence of Apple. This was Steve Jobs' vision for the company that he handed to posterity, that the company would move into this torus-shaped office building. And so
very good, very good.
For a lot of reasons, I thought it would be interesting today to zoom in on Apple Park to understand how it became a thing, why it became a thing, what it tells us about where Apple has come from, and, as we always say, where it might be heading next.
You mentioned that Apple Park is another Apple product. So I wondered if they have to drop the article from all of the words there. So instead of saying someone needs to go to the toilet, they have to say, I'm going to toilet, or I'm going to cafe, something like this. Please open door.
You mean like the way that you don't say the iPhone, you have to say iPhone?
Yeah, and a lot of other companies have started copying that now, and I find it interesting. A little bit annoying, but more interesting in the way that their language has changed.
They do that with Apple Park as well. You say, I'm going to Apple Park. You don't say, I'm going to the Apple Park.
Yeah, but that makes more sense for a place. I mean, you wouldn't say, I'm going to the London.
You might say, I'm going to the Netherlands.
In Catalan, they use it for people. So I'm talking to the Graham today.
Well, they do that in Spanish as well, like El Señor Charlie.
Oh, yeah, but not for proper names.
Okay, yeah.
You wouldn't speak to the Charlie in...
I'm speaking to the Charlie right now.
Well, in this case, there is only one.
There is only one.
So it's correct.
A couple more interesting things about Apple Park before we get into it. Do you know how much it cost? Do you want to take a guess? How much did Apple splurge on their fancy new crib?
It was something like 500 million or something.
$5 billion.
5 billion?
Yeah, it's a mind-blowing sum. And the technical term for this kind of building is a groundscraper. Have you heard of that?
No, but I like it.
Yeah. So in this sense, it's not high-rise. It's only 4 floors high, but it occupies a massive amount of ground. It's a huge circle. There's a circumference of 1 mile, and that makes it similar in size to another famous American ground scraper, which is...
The Pentagon?
Exactly. You can see a diagram of this on the Wikipedia page about it that overlays the Pentagon and Apple Park. And that similar size, the circle of Apple Park is actually slightly larger than the Pentagon, but the Pentagon has more floors. So overall, the Pentagon has a much bigger floor space. But in terms of...
It's probably harder to get into Apple Park than it is to get into the Pentagon.
Probably, yes. So I've got a couple of trivia questions for you, Charlie, as we normally do before we get into it. Are you poised and ready?
I'm always ready for trivia questions.
Okay. So the first one, this is actually going back to the topic of one of our previous shows, Apple Maps. What does the Apple Maps icon currently represent?
That's a good one. I would have said a while ago that it was One Infinite Loop, but now I guess maybe it's Apple Park.
It is, yeah. And do you know what road it shows?
Apple Park Road. Jobs Lane. I know the name of the street because I've heard it mentioned before, but I've forgotten it. So I guess that means I don't know it.
It's Interstate 280. So when Apple Maps originally launched, Apple was based in Infinite Loop. And later, when they moved their headquarters to Apple Park just down the road, they updated the icon. So if you look at the Apple Maps icon now, you see in the top right, there's a little circular bit.
Yeah.
And that's actually the corner of Apple Park. And the road is Interstate 280.
With the address, I wasn't actually that far off. The official address in the Maps app is Apple Inc. 1 Apple Park Way.
Well, I'm not sure that you can see Apple Park Way on the Apple Maps icon.
And
If we're going to get really pedantic about this.
what's this other section? Wait, I'm going to hold it up to you. What's this section here? This is like 2 long buildings.
That is the parking garage.
That's the parking. It's huge.
Yeah, it is.
It's California for you.
Well, actually, the original intention was that the parking would be subterranean underneath the landscaping. And most of it is, but they have these tube structures as well.
This is quite interesting on the map, actually.
Well, this might actually help you with the next trivia question if you're looking at the map now,
Okay.
although it feels a little bit like cheating.
Okay, I've put the map away.
What is the Glendenning Barn?
The Glendenning Barn? I don't know. Is it where? Maybe it's where Johnny Ive's white hyperbaric chamber is, where they will film his videos.
Well, that could well be the case, although they say that they use it now for storing park maintenance stuff. The Glendenning Barn was on the original site on which Apple Park was built, and it was constructed about 100 years ago when this plot of land belonged to the Glendenning family. And this was a farm, I think, apricot orchards.
Oh, yeah.
And this barn was part of the farm. It's a very unremarkable structure, to be honest, but the Cupertino Historical Society wanted to preserve this barn. Now, after this area was a farm, it became an office park that was occupied by Hewlett-Packard, and the barn was not knocked down, and Hewlett-Packard used it for company parties. I imagine like them having waffle parties there, in this weird barn surrounded by bland office park stuff. So part of the planning permission that Apple got to build Apple Park on this plot of land was that they had to preserve the barn. It was kind of in the way of their new circular building, so they took it apart like plank by plank and reassembled it to the edge of the site.
They've put it right next to the main road. It's like as far away as they could possibly put it.
I bet Johnny Ive really hated it and wanted to turn it into some chrome brushed metal garden equipment storage system.
Probably. So what's this other section here? Because so if you look at the map, there's a rectangular block cut by what looks like a freeway, and it seems that Apple has the main section of that. And next to the parking, there's a bunch of houses. What are they? Are they anything to do with Apple Park?
The Hampton Apartments. We're going to get into all of that. You're jumping ahead, Charlie, to all the good bits.
Well, this is what happens. Okay, well, let's tease us. We're foreshadowing.
Yeah, we're going to get into that, but you're right. If you're looking at the map, you'll see this beautiful, enormous, rectangular chunk of land.
I think rectangular is good. It really is.
Sorry, rectangular plot of land, and there was this bit that they wanted to buy in the bottom left-hand corner and they weren't allowed to buy, and I just imagine every time Steve Jobs and Johnny Ive looked at that corner that they couldn't get, it must have enraged them.
Yeah.
Anywho, let's get into it. Are you ready to get into it?
I'm ready to roll.
Okay, right. So setting the scene. It's June 7th, 2011. LMFAO's party rock anthem is getting everyone shuffling, and it's a great year for rippling muscle fans with the first Thor movie in cinemas and the Spartacus TV show just launching on Stars TV.
So a good year for you.
Yeah. All my favorite things happening concurrently. So Steve Jobs makes a trip to Cupertino City Council to present his ideas for Apple Park's new campus. Now, Charlie, what do you know about Cupertino?
The town or well, it's a town. It's a small town.
It's a city. It's a city.
Oh, is it a city? Okay, it's a city.
But it's interesting you say that because we as Brits, in Britain, we have a special meaning for city. Mm-hmm. And they do in America as well, but it's a completely different meaning. Do you know about that?
Yeah, well, for us, it's if it's got a cathedral in it.
Well, in the UK, you need to have a cathedral and you need a royal charter as well. You can't call yourself a city unless you have a royal charter. Whereas in the US, any settlement which has its own incorporated governance is technically a city.
Okay.
I looked into this because I was curious because do you know what the population of Cupertino is?
No idea.
60,000 people.
Oh, so it's not that big.
You know how many people work at Apple Park?
Something very similar. 50,000 people.
12,000 employees. So the equivalent of a fifth of the population of the entire city are working in Apple Park. And that's just one of their campuses because they still have Infinite Loop in Cupertino as well. So I think that when it all is said and done, probably they've got about 30,000 people working in Cupertino. So if you imagine when Steve Jobs is personally making a visit to Cupertino City Council to pitch his new office development, it gives you a sense of the relative power structure. Mm-hmm. These councillors that he's talking to are councillors of a city of 60,000 people, and he is the CEO of one of the largest companies on the planet. So he's humbly asking them to allow him to build a new office park in the fair city of Cupertino. But the funny thing is, I guess, that they can still say no. It would be crazy when you think about the tax revenue that Cupertino must get from this one massive occupant. And if Apple was to move out of Cupertino, goodness knows what it would do to the local economy. So, it's an interesting power balance in this meeting. So I don't think there was ever any question that Cupertino was going to sign off on the Apple Park construction. But I think that Steve Jobs chose to go along personally just because he was so incredibly proud of the plans for Apple Park. And as we'll see, he was very personally involved in the development of the concept of the Apple Park campus. And this would prove to be Steve Jobs' last major presentation in 2011. It was later that year that he passed away. And so this was like one of his last public appearances. And he said, I'm going to send you a little Steve Jobs quote for you to do your Steve Jobs impression, Charlie.
Okay. This land is special to me. When I was 13, Hewlett-Packard was my idol, and I called up Bill Hewlett and I asked him if he'd give me some spare parts for a frequency counter. He gave me a summer job at HP in Santa Clara, off 280, in the division that built frequency counters. HP built its computer systems division in Cupertino, and Apple bought it together with some adjacent properties. It all used to be apricot orchards.
I think there's a bit of romanticization going on here, actually. Hewlett-Packard did have offices on the site where Apple Park was built, but it wasn't their main campus. Their main campus was in Palo Alto, which is where Steve Jobs would have gone. The other thing that I find funny is it's true that this land that Apple bought used to be apricot orchards. Isn't it ironic, by the way, that it was apricot orchards rather than apple orchards? It would have been so much more perfect if it was an apple orchard, right?
Yeah, I'm surprised that one didn't go in the memory hole.
Yeah. There's an argument to say maybe rather than calling it Apple Park, they should have called it Apricot Park.
Yeah, there is an argument. That would have got you fired.
Last time Tim Cook visited the UK in December last year, he was a guest on a UK podcast called Table Manners.
Yeah.
And he brought them a gift of apricot jam that had been made at Apple Park.
Oh.
And he talked about how they'd restored apricots to this park. And I thought that was an interesting bit of trivia as well, is Apple actually makes apricot jam.
I'd love apricot jam. I would totally be in to try some of that. I like apricots in general.
Anyway, so Steve Jobs is getting nostalgic as he's pitching this project to Cupertino City Council. He's talking about how this used to be orchards. He's talking about how it used to be the Hewlett-Packard offices. And he's talking about how Bill Hewlett gave him his first big break in the industry. We'll include a link to Steve Jobs' presentation in the show notes, and I think it's well worth watching. I found it really funny the way that Steve Jobs veered from being very congenial and modest and just charming to being a little bit edgy and threatening, depending on whether the councillors were giving him praise, which he accepted with a lot of grace, or when they were like asking him, what could the city's citizens expect to get out of Apple for signing off on this? And could they have free Wi-Fi, Steve? So the location, Cupertino, it's a suburb of San Jose with a population of around 1 million, which in turn is part of the urban sprawl, which comprises San Francisco, San Jose, Oakland, and collectively that area is known as the Bay Area. A little bit of geography of the Bay Area. For our purposes, what's important about San Jose is that it's at the heart of Silicon Valley, and Silicon Valley roughly corresponds to the geographic region of the Santa Clara Valley, which is a big groove formed rather troublingly by the San Andreas Fault. And the northern end of this groove is filled with water, and that is the San Francisco Bay. So Silicon Valley is located right on a fissure in the Earth's mantle, which could really at any point give.
Perfect.
So the history of the population of this place, it was settled by the Spanish in the 16th century, and the area was known as the Valley of Heart's Delights because of all the orchards.
Oh.
Sadly, these days, the Valley of Heart's Delights is no longer covered in orchards. In fact, it's just covered in suburban sprawl. So freeways, business parks, strip malls, and housing subdivisions. It's just an endless, sprawling space that you can really only navigate by car. So the birthplace of Silicon Valley, do you know where it all started, Charlie? Why Silicon Valley became a thing?
Well, because of all of the computer companies that were opening up in the area, no?
And which was the first?
I'm thinking, was it HP?
It was indeed HP. It started in a one-car garage of a small family house in Palo Alto near Stanford, where Dave Packard and Bill Hewlett founded Hewlett-Packard in 1938. They were both alumni of Stanford. So really the existence of Stanford University was the seed that kicked off Silicon Valley. And here's a picture of the house I'm going to send you. What do you see there?
I see a tree-lined street, a house set back slightly with a walled-in front porch. It looks very cozy, and it has a commemorative sign outside.
It does, yeah. That was 1938. And another 38 years later, in 1976, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak co-founded Apple in another Silicon Valley garage, which was the garage of Steve Jobs' family home. Although this seems to have been a bit of a myth. I think maybe Steve Jobs put out this idea that they started Apple in his family garage to key into the mythology of Hewlett-Packard. But according to Steve Wozniak, he said that was more of a spiritual home and they never actually did any work in the garage. And all of the work and the development of the original Apple computer was done elsewhere. Mostly Woz did that at his home. Yeah. So, which kind of makes sense. Why would Woz go to Steve Jobs' parents' garage to develop a computer when he could just do it in his own home, which is what he apparently did.
So Steve Jobs had already started airbrushing Woz out of Apple's history.
Yeah, and I guess mythologizing a little bit, because at least according to Woz, it wasn't ever really true. It was more of a foundational myth of Apple that Steve Jobs put out. And Steve Jobs' family garage wasn't actually in Cupertino, but it was just on the edges of Cupertino, between Cupertino and Los Altos. Let's take a look now at Steve Jobs' garage. What are you seeing there?
I see a one-story house. The other one was 2 stories with an attic. I see a one-story kind of very typical, looking California suburban home, spread out, huge, double wide garage.
It's quite a stylish design, I think,
it's not
as
bad.
These things go. Mm-hmm. In the UK, we'd call that a bungalow. I don't know if that's a term.
That's a big bungalow, though.
It's a big, beautiful bungalow. It's a private residence, so it'd be weird to live in that house. Can you imagine living in the house where Steve Jobs founded Apple? I wonder if that has an effect on its real estate value, and you must have gawkers walking past all the time.
Yeah, that would be annoying.
This doesn't have a commemorative sign like the Hewlett-Packard garage does.
It does have several no trespassing signs, though.
Oh, yeah. Keep away from us, you Jobs-obsessed freaks.
Yes.
Yeah.
Stay away.
Anyway, this idea of people founding Silicon Valley companies in garages persists to this day. I think lots of people like the idea that they might launch a business in a garage. And I don't even know why, if you've got a nice bungalow like that, why would you go, right, I'm just going into the garage to build a computer? It's like, why do you need to do that in the garage?
Well, it's where the space is, no? I mean, if you're going to put a load of junk out, you can leave it out, especially if you live with your parents. Have you seen the movie Primer, where they accidentally invent time travel in the garage? Spoiler.
Oh, well, no, that sounds like Rick and Morty.
Primer's probably not quite like Rick and Morty.
I'm sure that Rick and Morty and the grandpa in the garage, I'm sure that comes from this Hewlett-Packard, Steve Jobs myth as well.
I mean, we used to build go-karts in the garage. So, I don't think it's that crazy to make things.
That is why you are a humble podcast host and not Steve Jobs, because he was busily building an empire and you were building a go-kart.
Yeah, well, that's true. I should have. Yeah, I mean, I did program a racing car game.
Okay.
On my Spectrum, but that wasn't in the garage. That was upstairs.
Which is precisely my point. Why would people go into the garage to do these things?
But they were building a computer. They weren't programming it.
Okay.
I mean, imagine you live at home with your parents.
Yeah.
It's his parents' house,
Yeah.
right? Steve, you've left circuit boards all over the kitchen table again. Put them away. We're having dinner. I mean, come on. Of course you're going to go in the garage. Or maybe your bedroom, I guess.
I don't know, but garages can be cold and damp and maybe not the best environment to be handling.
As it was, they didn't use the garage. They used Steve Wozniak's bedroom.
Yeah. So, they were lying. I mean, this wasn't even true. It's like a myth. So moving on from this mythological garage origins, Apple, as it grew, moved to various office locations in Cupertino before they eventually built their first campus. You already mentioned the name of that, Charlie. Do you want to mention the name of their first campus again?
Yeah, One Infinite Loop.
That's right. And tell us about Infinite Loop. What's an infinite loop?
An infinite loop is a loop that carries on forever. I mean, I guess any loop is an infinite. Any loop is an infinite loop.
Essentially a loop that is infinite.
Yeah, but all loops are infinite in a way, no? Aren't they? I mean, they just go round and round.
Well, I think in programming terms, you might have loops in code and you specify the number of loops that it should go through, or it should carry on looping until some condition is met or something like that. Yeah. So if you look at Infinite Loop on Apple Maps, which is literally just down the road from Apple Park on the intersection of Interstate 280 and Asner Boulevard, you can see it. The shape of the campus is kind of like an Olympic running track or like a pill shape. And it's got the car parks all arranged on the outside. And then it's got a little park in the middle and buildings arranged around it. And so in that sense, it's conceptually not so very different from Apple Park in that there's a park in the middle with buildings arranged around it and the cars kept out of the way. But Apple Park was done on a much bigger and grander scale. It's something which I think you often see about Steve Jobs' thinking is that these patterns or ways of thinking that he has, they keep re-emerging in different ways.
Yeah.
When they started growing again, when Steve Jobs returned in 1997, the company went through a very rapid growth period and they added lots of businesses like the iCloud business and the apps business, all these different businesses that they were adding and more and more people. And then eventually, obviously, adding their phone business. And these people could not all fit on the Infinite Loop campus. So they started buying out all these different offices in Cupertino. And I think there was a point at which maybe a third of the office space in Cupertino belonged to Apple. And it just wasn't tenable. Infinite Loop could only support around 2,600 to 2,800 people. And Apple had 12,000 people in the area at this point in its various offices. So they wanted to consolidate just on two campuses, Infinite Loop and the second campus that they wanted to build. So what they started doing was they started buying plots of land secretly and combining them together further east on the Interstate 280 towards San Jose.
It's so Apple.
Yeah, well, this is apparently the way in which it's done, because one of the issues is if you combine plots of land, it gets more valuable. And this is coming back to the top of the show, Charlie. You pointed out the Hamptons apartment homes, which takes a big bite out of the side of the Apple Park campus. And why does it do that? Well, Apple was using lots of front companies to make these acquisitions of parcels of land, combining them together to keep its intentions a secret. I mean, it would be very difficult in a small city like Cupertino when you've got a literal elephant in the room, which is Apple. If Apple starts buying all these different properties, then the property owners will realize, oh, I've got this plot of land, which is right in the middle of these plots of land that Apple has been buying. And that makes my plot of land much more valuable to Apple, so I can charge more. So what Apple have been doing is like covering their tracks. It is perfectly legal, but using different companies to make these acquisitions on their behalf at different times. So no one could see the pattern emerging of what Apple was doing. They were keeping it top secret that they were acquiring this huge chunk of land. I think even then, and even more so these days, whenever anyone sees Apple on Apple Maps as well, it really looks like a nice little street.
Yeah.
And they just didn't want to sell. And one of the reasons for that is at this point, I think they probably knew that Apple was going ahead with Apple Park regardless, which would make the price of these properties stratospherically high. Because effectively what you have is a home that's kind of in Apple Park, right? I don't know, if I worked for Apple and my office was Apple Park, it would be a short walk home after work. You're literally like living on the campus. And so I think that they figured that however much Apple paid them for the plot of land, their properties were worth even more if they didn't sell out. That is my interpretation of it.
Do you think they get free Wi-Fi? I bet Steve Jobs told the construction people to make the most noise at that edge of the site. There's a motorway, I think it's in China. The government wanted to build a road, so they bought up all of the property around there. But somebody refused to move. I'm surprised they got away with it in China. I don't know how that works, but they refused to sell. And so the motorway just goes around, it splits.
Oh,
it's like
I think I've seen that video. Yeah.
It's like a big FU to the people in there, because it's like the motorway is on either side of them. So I guess there must be a little little bridge to get out, a little tunnel. But yeah, it's kind of funny.
Yeah, so that's the story behind the Hampton apartment homes. I love their tenacity. They really hung in there. Okay, so let's get into the building itself. The Pentagon is 6.7 million square foot, which in real money is 620,000 square meters. And it houses 26,000 employees. So for comparison, Apple Park is 2.8 million square foot, which is 260,000 square meters. The reason the floor space is considerably smaller is because Apple Park only has 4 floors. So it's very, very low rise. Mm-hmm. And Apple Park has 12,000 employees, which compares with the Pentagon, which is 26,000. So although in terms of footprint, Apple Park is slightly larger than the Pentagon, because it's lower rise, it's kind of like half the size in terms of office space. Apple Park has 4 floors, whereas the Pentagon has 7. I think 7 is also very low rise for an American building. And this is the nature of these ground scrapers. It literally is like taking a skyscraper and resting it on its side, volumetrically speaking. What's interesting here is when you think about ground scrapers compared to skyscrapers, spatially, I think one of the things to me that's interesting is everyone in a skyscraper is kind of closer to each other because everyone is just an elevator ride away. But the diameter of Apple Park is 1 mile. So even if you're technically in the same office building, you can actually be much further away than, say, at Infinite Loop. Mm-hmm. Say, if you're working on the other side of Infinite Loop, it's like a 5-minute walk across the garden to go and see your colleague. Whereas if you're in Apple Park, it could be like a 20-minute walk.
They've got bikes though, right? Have they got bikes on campus? I think they've got like electric bikes.
This style of office building is more of a government office building style. There's actually a building in the UK which Apple Park very much resembles. Do you know what that is?
Is it GCHQ?
It is GCHQ, informally known as the Donut, which takes us back to that again. So GCHQ is the UK's intelligence headquarters. It's about half the size of Apple Park with a diameter of 600 feet, and it only has 5,500 employees. So that's kind of half of Apple Park. The reason that GCHQ was designed to look like this is because the UK government employees were very inspired by the Pentagon. They wanted to have an iconic building for the UK intelligence organization that would rival the Pentagon. And so they thought, oh, well, you know, those damn Yanks have a Pentagon. We shall have a circle.
No, we should have a hexagon. We're going to go one better.
I don't know if the GCHQ headquarters was an inspiration for Apple Park, but they do superficially look very similar. This sort of ground scraper office architecture is, to me, a little bit surprising for Apple because, to me, it screams bureaucracy. It doesn't really scream innovative, edgy, Silicon Valley challenger brand. What do you think about that?
I like it. I think it's a building for people to work, to be in. I think it seems quite pleasant. From what I've seen from the pictures inside, there's lots of light. It's low rise, so it doesn't really impact on the surroundings quite so much. It's in nice grounds. I don't know. The skyscraper is a big erection.
Well, you're selling it to me.
I don't like skyscrapers. They are very separate from their surroundings, even while they dominate them. And they really are just kind of a big penis substitute for the person who wants them. Whereas, this big round building, it just seems much nicer. It seems much more on a human scale, even though it's a mile around.
I would actually argue it's the other way around because I think, we live in the city of Barcelona and Barcelona is considered to be by many a triumph of town planning. The whole grid system that we have in Barcelona is super dense in terms of the number of people that live here per square foot. It's very high.
I think it's the densest in Europe.
Yeah. And the density, I think, is one of the strengths because if you have a lot of people living close together, then you can have lots of like really nice services. We have loads of cafes on the streets and there's a sort of buzz about the place and a life to the place.
But that's in a city. You're not going to stick a skyscraper out in the middle of the suburbs.
Well, exactly. But this, to me, is the essence of it, that by building like this, you create suburbs because there's no density. You can't have anything going on here because everyone is so spread out. If you work in the center of a city, if you work in San Francisco rather than in Cupertino, then you can like pop down at lunchtime and go to one of hundreds of different interesting options rather than everyone has to go to Cafe Max. And you can meet interesting people and see surprising things. You live and work in a city with a rich culture and that can inspire and inform your work. Whereas I think something like Apple Park is a fake park where everyone exists in the same sterile culture.
You're not talking about the difference between a high-rise and a low-rise. You're talking about the difference between a city and the suburbs.
That's right. But to locate a company the size of Apple with 12,000 employees on this one site, you couldn't do that in a city without having something quite high rise. I mean, maybe not a skyscraper, but it needs to be high rise to achieve that density. You know, I would never want to work in the suburbs. Apart from anything else, one of the things is to work at Apple, it's therefore required that you drive a car.
Yeah.
Taking a step back, why did Steve Jobs think it would be great to build this massive government-style groundscraper that looks like the Pentagon and GCHQ? Why did Steve Jobs think that, that would be just the thing for Apple? The reason is because he actually had some quite strong ideas about office buildings, and they actually started with going to the toilet. Do you know about this?
No.
So when in 1997 Steve Jobs returned to Apple, he was also the CEO of another company, Pixar, and he had been involved in designing the new office headquarters for Pixar. And he had a lot of ideas about this. He'd thought long and hard about office buildings. And he felt that one of the things that was really important to create an innovative company was for there to be lots of unexpected encounters and meetings between different people.
In the toilets?
Yes.
Oh,
yeah, this is what I'm getting into. So his recollections from his first time at Apple at Infinite Loop was that Cafe Max, the main cafeteria, was really important. So it wasn't just the formal meetings where the important stuff happened, but it would be those informal and unexpected encounters at Cafe Max that would result in many important aha moments.
I imagine that if you were to have an unscheduled meeting with somebody from a different department and start sharing ideas at Apple, you probably get fired.
Yeah, because it's so top secret.
Yeah.
Exactly. But the idea that he then had at Pixar, and I think he must have been so hated for this, he thought, well, wouldn't it be great if we just had one set of restrooms in the middle of the building so that if you needed a comfort break, you'd have to walk all the way across the building to this one village of restrooms. And in so doing, he would create these unexpected encounters that would result in innovation like Ratatouille.
Yeah, so you meet somebody in the bathroom, you're both taking a leak, and you're like, oh, that's better. And then, you know what we should do? Toy Story 4.
Well, exactly. I just find it so funny. But anyway, there's one of those things when I read that, this was in Ed Catmull's book, Creativity Inc., that he describes how they built their headquarters with one set of toilets. I was sort of nodding along and it's like, oh, unexpected encounters. No, that's very interesting. And I thought I can totally see the parallels with Apple Park. But then when I thought about it some more, I thought, well, no, hang on, one set of toilets in a massive office building. I mean, that's just crazy.
It's probably illegal.
I'm glad to say that as far as I know, there is more than one set of restrooms in Apple Park. You don't have to walk 1 mile around the circumference of the building to get to the restrooms. But one of the things I remember Steve Jobs explaining about the donut-shaped design of Apple Park was that he thought that people would have to walk across the donut hole in the middle to go to meetings with colleagues. And so there would be unexpected encounters in the park. So the park was the equivalent to the washroom.
The equivalent of Hampstead Heath.
Yeah. Well, that would be a different kind of unexpected encounter. I think Hampstead Heath, I'm not going to explain that. Listener, if you don't know, it's best you don't know. So this was the idea. What do you think about that? Do you think that a donut-shaped building like Apple Park might result in unexpected encounters that could give us a new iPhone design?
Well, I mean, I made a joke earlier, but I don't think people are allowed to talk about things like this amongst departments. So, it's all kept very segregated. So the idea that people would talk between their different sections while walking along seems unlikely. But I'd say it's more of a policy thing. If you have a corporate environment where you are encouraged to get away from your desk and move around, that's one thing. If you're in a kind of place where they time your trips to the single toilet in the building and you get in trouble for taking too much time away from your desk, then no matter what the architecture is like, you're still going to have to rush back. So I don't know.
That's interesting you say that because, Google used to have this thing where they would give their employees, I think, 1 day a week to do their own personal projects to allow unexpected, innovative things to emerge. Whereas Steve Jobs gave his employees like a long walk to the restroom to see if innovative things would emerge.
There you go.
Which I find funny. But one of the things I would say is I think, yes, it's true that if you're an Apple employee, you're not allowed to talk to people outside of your project team about the project you're currently working on. But I don't think that precludes you to talk about things that you're not currently working on, like ideas of future things. So I guess that's probably what Steve Jobs had in mind. Whether or not it actually happens in practice, we don't know.
So they meet in the toilet at Apple Park and then the same conversation as at Pixar and they're like, oh, that's better. You know what we should do? iPhone 17.
So I guess in classic fashion, with Steve Jobs, when he'd come to this idea, we're going to build this massive groundscraper. It's going to be the best headquarters building that has ever been built. Then he wants to get the very best architects to design this thing. And do you know what architects he selected?
No, I've forgotten.
Well, like Johnny Ive, Steve Jobs seemed to have a taste for British designers. So this is like a British architect, Norman Foster.
Was it Norman Foster?
Yeah, Norman Foster Associates. So do you know the other iconic buildings that Norman Foster designed?
He's done one of the skyscrapers, no? The Shard or one of these, the walkie-talkie in London.
Well, no, he did the Gherkin.
The Gherkin,
Norman
was
Foster
it. That was the
did
one.
The Gherkin in London, which is a sort of phallic-shaped skyscraper in the city of London. One of his earliest really iconic ones was HSBC Hong Kong.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
If you remember that one.
I do.
And then the one that I thought you would say, because you used to live in this city, a certain government building in Berlin.
Oh, did he do the Reichstag?
He did indeed. I wanted you to say that because I knew if I said it, then you would say I pronounced it wrong.
Go on. How's it pronounced?
I would say Reichstag.
Well, it depends on where you are in the country, but yeah, that would be okay. The accents.
Okay.
Vary.
So, and then in Barcelona, we have a gigantic Norman Foster construction. Do you know what that is?
Is it the other Gherkin? Is it the Torre Glorias?
The Torre de Collserola.
Oh, okay. Is that what it's called now?
It's like a radio tower on the top of the...
Oh, yeah, of course. That's it. Oh, I did know that. Yeah, that one's cool. It looks like it's on a stick. It's like a big building on a stick. And
that's
secured in place by cables. It's quite cool.
And one of my favourite Norman Foster buildings is the Great Court at the British Museum. Norman Foster is an absolutely brilliant architect. All of these buildings that we've mentioned, they're kind of glass and steel and super modernistic, but they would always have some kind of clever thought behind them. It's a very cerebral kind of architecture, I would say. So Norman Foster, as the choice of architect, Steve Jobs had picked someone at the height of his career, one of like a handful of the world's most prestigious architects. Going back to that meeting at Cupertino City Council, here is what Steve Jobs said about that. I'm going to send you a quote, Charlie.
Am I reading this out?
You're reading this out.
Yeah, go on. We've hired some great architects to work with, some of the best in the world, and we've come up with a design that puts 12,000 people in one building. Think about that. That's rather odd. We've seen these office parks with lots of buildings and they get pretty boring pretty fast. And we'd like to do something better than that.
What do you make of that?
It's Steve Jobs, isn't it? I mean, talking it up.
Yeah.
It's a big round building. It's cool and all, and it looks nice, and the details are great, and there's lots of glass and it's open. But it's not particularly... I mean, it's still an office building full of people.
Well, I was thinking about this in terms of... It's a strange choice, I guess, to do an episode on an office building for this show, and I thought long and hard about it because I was thinking, well, why do I want to do an episode about Apple Park when we normally do episodes about products? And I think, unlike most office buildings, this office building is so intrinsic to the Apple brand today. Like the way in which whenever they launch a new product, the product launch is now intrinsically linked to Apple Park. And in fact, one of the original ideas they had was they were going to have this theater and they would do all their keynotes in this theater. And then when Steve Jobs passed away, they called it the Steve Jobs Theater. And they do have some events there, but actually they've moved to this new format of doing these videos for product launches. And they're almost invariably somewhere on the donut, right? They might be on the donut roof or in the space in the middle or around it. But the donut looms ever present in their corporate presentations. And it's become much more so than any other company's headquarters, intrinsically linked to Apple as a brand, to such an extent that if there was a situation where Apple had to sell Apple Park,
Yeah.
I think that they would knock that building down. I don't think they would allow another company to move in there. I mean, can you imagine it? It's so intrinsically linked. It's a little bit like, the Apple store on Fifth Avenue in New York with a cube. Steve Jobs negotiated some special deal whereby if they ever sold that location, they could take the cube with them. And the simple reason was because that cube was an Apple design. It would not be okay for, I don't know, Primark or TK Maxx to put their logo in that cube, right? It's not going to happen. That's an Apple branded thing. And this massive building, as big as the Pentagon, it's an Apple branded thing, and Apple runs in the DNA of this building.
Maybe they could sell it to Dunkin' Donuts.
It's called Dunkin' now. You can get with the program. It's not Dunkin' Donuts
Dunkin'
anymore.
Park. Like Linkin Park.
So Norman Foster was the lead architect on this thing, but Johnny Ive became very closely involved. And this period then, construction began in 2014 when Steve Jobs had pitched it in 2011. What he'd said to the Cupertino Council was that they planned to start work on it in 2012. That didn't happen. There were various construction delays, so it didn't actually begin construction until 2014. So Steve Jobs didn't get to see his project get underway. Incredibly, they built it in 3 years. This massive project was built in 3 years. I find that pretty amazing. So it opened in 2017. And as I said, they spent $5 billion on it. So there's a lot you can do to expedite a project if you're prepared to spend $5 billion on it. And during that period from 2012 to 2017, Johnny Ive became increasingly involved in the project. In fact, he was leading the project from a design perspective. As far as I can tell from reading reports when Johnny Ive left Apple, the impression that I get is he was sort of being moved aside during this time. He was encouraged to focus on Apple Park and was sort of moved away from the day-to-day design work of Apple products. So around this time, we had stuff like the iPhone X coming out, and that was obviously a massively important redesign of the iPhone, a shake-up of how the iPhone worked. And Johnny Ive was sort of distant from that, even though he was still the head of design. But from what I read, he was more distant from the work on that. He signed off on it, but wasn't really involved because his day-to-day focus during this period was Apple Park. He was also involved at this time in the redesign of Apple stores. Lots of the design language that Johnny Ive developed for the redesign of the Apple stores made its way into Apple Park as well, to the extent that I think if you see the photos of Cafe Max and Apple Park with the indoor trees and all the chrome and glass, it looks like an Apple store. If you look at the spiral staircase that goes down into the Steve Jobs Theater, that also looks like a stairway that you might find.
Yeah, that really it really feels like an Apple store.
Yeah. So this was Johnny Ive's last major project for Apple, and it's very much connecting the dots in terms of the architectural design language between Apple's retail efforts around the world and its headquarters in Cupertino. And it was a massive passion project. I read recently an interview that Johnny Ive did when he was talking about this, and he was obsessed. He was focusing on all these little details like the smart locks. Have you ever heard of the A1844?
No. Well, no, I don't think so. Give me a clue.
I'm going to send you a link with a picture of the A1844.
Wireless device. Door assembly with reader. Okay, so it's a door handle.
Yeah, but it's a beautiful minimalist door handle with the reader, what do you call it? NFC reader.
Yeah.
It's got an integrated NFC reader in this beautiful brushed aluminum door handle. The A1844 is a product that Apple had to get approved by the FCC because it has this NFC technology in it.
Right.
People saw the application for this and they say, oh, wow, like Apple's getting into door readers.
Yeah.
So this is an Apple product. It's designed by Johnny Ive and his team. It looks like an Apple product. It's a beautiful, I mean, I think you were a little dismissive there, Charlie. I think it is a beautiful door assembly with reader.
It's the best door assembly with reader I've ever seen.
Yeah, it also, I think if you look at the second picture, it has this glowing circle that glows different colors depending upon whether or not you're granted access to the particular door that you're trying to open. It makes all these noises. And Johnny Ive spent ages on the A1844. And, I think there's no other office building would you find that they have a component like this, which is custom designed just for this one office building.
Okay, as a contrast to this incredible attention to detail, I'd like to point out the elevator buttons in the basement car park don't line up. Apparently, I haven't been there, but I heard I think it was on ATP they were talking about it.
Oh, I think I heard about this, yeah.
Yeah. They don't line up.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
I wonder how that happened.
I don't know. Johnny Ive took his eye off the ball, I guess.
Other things to say about it. So when Apple bought these sites, one of the statistics they claimed was that it was 20% landscaping and 80% surface parking. So 80% concrete and 20% green. They managed to get the surface parking down by 90%. And they did that by putting it underground, building this new park on top. And they took it from 3,700 trees on the site to 6,000 trees on the site. And they even hired an arborist from Stanford. This is, again, such a Johnny Ive move. We talked about in the last episode how Johnny Ive got a horologist, or the world's leading horologists to consult when he was designing the Apple Watch. So when Apple Park,
that would make
he
a
gets
great
the world's
t-shirt.
leading...
That would make a great Apple Core t-shirt. World's leading horologist.
Oh, yes.
Or a mug.
Oh, we're going to do
a
that.
Mug.
It's basically an IST, where the arborists are kind of tree experts, horologists are clock experts. Johnny Ive would always get an IST, a consultant IST. And yeah, so they planted loads of extra trees. And, it's taken a few years for the park to grow in. But I mean, I would have to say, for the roof of a massive parking garage, it looks pretty good. It's an underground car park with trees planted on top. The only reason you've got those two parking garages on the south side of the plant, and this is something Steve Jobs explained in the Cupertino Council meeting, was they couldn't quite fit all the cars they needed in the underground space. So then they had to have these multi-story parking garages as well. That gives you an idea of just how many cars there are on the site.
It's insane.
It's a bit misleading then to imagine that the cars are just those two. I mean, it's an optical illusion. This is no different to any other out-of-town office park. The whole thing is one massive car park. The only difference is they've put this landscape roof on top of it. Does that change your thinking about it at all?
Yeah, I don't like cars. But like you say, the only way of getting here is cars. But maybe Apple could have organized some actual proper public transport for this, or even private transport. With the 5 billion, you could buy a few buses, and I'm sure they do have buses. But
like when they were working on the Apple car and their self-driving technology, and they used their self-driving technology for the coaches that took employees from San Francisco to Apple Park.
Yeah.
One of the things I am curious about is to what extent it's even possible for a pedestrian to arrive at Apple Park. If you were a resident of the Hamptons apartment homes, you probably have to walk a few miles, even though you're right next to the donut. You'd have to walk a few miles to actually get to the entrance. And the entrances are all car entrances.
It's like trying to ride a bike to most airports. It's fine.
Yeah, exactly that. Exactly like that, yeah. I'm ambivalent about it. I think on the one hand, I love Norman Foster's architecture, and I do think it's a beautiful building. And I love the fact that they've replanted all these trees. I do think that the greenery, now that it's all grown in, I think it looks great. I do think it gives them this iconic additional aspect to the brand. But in the same way, I feel like the shift from these in-person keynotes that Steve Jobs used to do that had that frisson of excitement. Is frisson a thing? Did I make that up?
No, you made it up. No, it's real. It's real.
And Steve Jobs would present these things live, and it was exciting and it was real. And now they've moved to these pre-recorded videos, high production values that are shot at Apple Park, and they somehow feel fake. And also, there was no way when in 2011 Steve Jobs was pitching Apple Park to Cupertino City Council, he couldn't know that just a few years later we'd have the COVID epidemic. And that obviously changed so much about the way that we work today. And it sort of, this is another word, I'm not sure if it's the right word, but Apple Park became a bit like a boondoggle. Is that the right word? Or, or a white elephant?
Boondoggle.
A white elephant. They built this massive office, and then world events would lead us to realize that actually remote working is a thing, especially for the kind of work that people at Apple do. Maybe not for some of the hardware people, but even for a lot of the hardware people, and certainly for the software people, a huge amount can be done remotely. And if you read social media posts from some current or former Apple employees, a lot were quite disgruntled about the return to work order.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, of course. Now you have to drive 50 miles, spend
Yeah.
spend
Yeah.
3
So
hours.
from their perspective, they've been working remotely and everything had been going great. And it's suddenly, oh, you have to come back into the office. And I think a lot of employees felt like, well, why? We don't need to go back into the office. Everything was going great. It's obvious that Apple would want people to go back into the office because of the Apple culture.
Yeah.
And the Apple culture goes back to this idea that Steve Jobs had about the restrooms. These unexpected encounters was a big part of what made a company innovative. And the donut shape of Apple Park had been designed so you were supposed to have these unexpected encounters.
I'm going to fix this now for Apple. Everyone can work from home, but when they need to pee, they have to go into Apple Park and use the toilets.
Where they've arrived at now is that you have to go in for 3 days a week and you can work remotely for 2 days a week. They've got this massive park now, which maybe they didn't need, but they spent $5 billion on it. And I think that there might be a thinking of, I'll be damned if we're not going to have people in this office now we've built it.
Well, that's the reason why a lot of bosses want their employees to return to work. Now, part of it is like seeing your employees. It's like the people you own, seeing them there and having them rather than at home. I think it's an important part of it for some office bosses. Maybe not for Tim Cook, but who knows?
I think you're right. Some bosses feel more like a boss if they've got people they can physically boss around. I think that's true. I think there's also a trust issue with some legitimacy that, you don't know how much work you're getting out of someone if you can't see them working.
But if you see them working, they're just goofing off on Facebook anyway. Well, not Facebook now, but
Yeah, that's true.
If you don't think you can trust your workers, don't hire them in the first place. And also in every study, if you just look at them, every single study or look at this, people do get more done and better when they work from home and faster. So yeah, sure, you're stopping to put in your washing and hang out your washing or, just take a break and have a nap because you're tired. But you're actually getting more work done than you do in the office. If you're at home and you've got 4 hours worth of work to do, you don't spread it out throughout the day. You just do it. Maybe you even do a bit more.
Yeah, I completely agree. So I think I've been a little bit hard on Apple Park. I said I do like the design of it aesthetically, but I don't like the design of it conceptually, I guess. But the last bit that I wanted to say about this is you have to put it into a context of its equivalents. So Apple isn't the only giant Silicon Valley company with a huge campus. You've also got the Googleplex, and Facebook has one of these as well. And from talking to people that work in Silicon Valley, Apple Park is one of the nicer megacorp campuses in Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
If you're going to work in a Silicon Valley megacorp campus, then Apple Park might be one of the nicer ones.
Yeah.
Did Steve Jobs achieve his goal of building the world's greatest office building?
Of course it is.
I absolutely do not believe that he achieved that for 1 minute. If you step outside at Apple Park to touch the grass is actually, well, it's not fake grass, but it's actually the roof of a car park. The whole thing is controlled by one company. It's one singular vision. It looks like the same architecture in every Apple retail store around the world. And I think it engenders a monoculture. And in that sense, however beautiful it is, if you don't have that diversity in your environment, if you don't have the opportunity to go to one of 100 different restaurants at lunchtime rather than going to Cafe Max, then I think you're losing something. And so to me, I think is aesthetically a design success, but conceptually, in my opinion, a design failure.
So here, are you describing Apple Park or are you describing the App Store? Because they sound very similar. Apple's walled garden in both cases.
Well, that's true. It is a walled garden. What do you think? We're rounding up now, Charlie. Love it, hate it. What do you think about Apple Park?
Okay, I agree that I prefer things to be in the city. I've worked in out-of-town places and I've worked in cities, and the cities are always much, much nicer because, you can pop out and do things at lunchtime. You can, I don't know, it's just nicer. You can get to them in a more sustainable way. You can either walk, ride a bike, take the public transport. I think that if you are going to have a corporate headquarters out in somewhere like this, which is kind of, imagine, where are they going to put it? San Francisco. It would have probably cost more than $5 billion in that case. And it's how things are built out there. It's California, everything's spread out. There's a lot of sprawl. So considering it as what it is, I think it's pretty nice. If you were to work in there just as a building, there's lots of glass. It's very open. The outside is very present. All of those trees by the world's best arborist. It's very nice. Taking it for what it is, I think it's nice. If I had to work in a corporate center in the middle of suburbia with nothing around me, I would probably choose this one. I've just been taking a look at Facebook's headquarters and Google's headquarters, and they are both way nastier.
I think you're right. If you take it as a given that this is the location of Silicon Valley companies, they have suburban out-of-town campuses, I'm not sure you could do it better than Apple Park. I think that's a fair point. Okay, well, any final words before we round up, Charlie?
I just wanted to mention one of the stories I liked that is very Johnny Ive, is that when they first opened up the building and started moving employees there, people were walking into glass walls all the time. So they had to put stickers on. And I just imagine him. I mean, I used to run restaurants and we had glass doors, and you have to put stickers on them because drunk or sober, people are going to walk into glass doors, especially when drunk. You just don't see it there. And if you look after the place well, and I imagine that those windows are always very clean and free of marks.
Of course.
You just don't know it's there. And it's very easy if you're distracted in having a random encounter with somebody deep in talking about Toy Story 4, then then you might walk into it. So that's exactly what happened. And I think it's typical Johnny Ive design. It's beautiful and minimal, but impractical. So they had to put stickers on the windows on all these glass walls so people wouldn't walk into them. And I think he must have hated that. I imagine.
I mean, that can't look good.
No.
I wonder how long it will be before Apple Park needs a refit. And in that sense, like the M4 MacBooks got a redesign to address some of the maybe extremes of the Johnny Ive era. And maybe Apple Park one day will get a refit and become a bit more conservative, which would kind of suck, to be honest.
I can imagine they'd like adding more toilets. I know that this one doesn't just have the central one, but
I believe that the poor, long-suffering Pixar employees must have more restrooms by now. I hope so.
Maybe they just have buckets by their desks.
Okay, well, I think that's it for this episode, cool. Mr. Charlie, unless you have anything else to add.
No, I'm done.
If people want to connect with you online, how can they do that?
You can find me at Mastodon, Mr. Charlie at indieweb.social.
Okay, and I'm on Blue Sky, Graham Bauer at bsky.social. And if you enjoyed this episode and you're feeling particularly generous, you could give us a star rating and a review on Apple Podcasts. It really, really helps with our visibility as we are growing the show. And I want to say a quick thank you to our sound engineer and technology consultant, Martin Algeston, for making us sound both fabulous and also technologically correct. And also, if you want to support the podcast, then please do check out our brand new merch store on TeePublic. You can access it via our brand new website, applecorepod.com, and you'll find t-shirts, sweatshirts, tote bags, mugs, stickers, and more with retro geek designs by yours truly. And so until next time, bye-bye.
Goodbye.